This is the WTF Bach podcast. The podcast about Johann Sebastian Bach, brought to you by his prodigal son, WTF Bach. Join WTF Bach as he guides your mind through a contrapuntal journey. Why don't you let WTF Bach guide you? And now, here's WTF Bach.
Hello everyone, WTF Bach here. It's Monday, the 17th of November at 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and on Friday I got a notification that today, in 1 hour in fact, the Bach Archive in Leipzig is unveiling what they claim are two newly discovered solo works by Bach, the first discovery of the sort in over 20 years. This is from the website now. Quote, "The premiere of two previously unknown solo works by Johann Sebastian Bach marks the beginning of a week of celebrations that will go down in music history. On Monday, the 17th of November at 3 p.m., two previously unknown solo works by Johann Sebastian Bach will be presented to the public for the first time at St. Thomas Church in Leipzig. The compositions will be performed as part of a ceremony marking the start of the 75 years of the Bach Archive Leipzig celebrations. This is the first discovery of new Bach works in over 20 years. So I'm going to sort of live stream this stream and this episode, but since I have no idea what's going on, and again, that's all the website says, I figure most of it's going to be in German. I don't know if it's going to be subtitled. I assume I'll understand most of the German, but I might not. So anyways, what I'm going to do is watch it, comment on it as I'm watching it. You may hear some German speeches. You most certainly will hear some German speeches, but I'll try to cut to the quick, and when the stream ends, I'll hopefully be able to snip out the interesting bits for you, talk about the pieces if I can say anything interesting about them. The first time the world is hearing these pieces, obviously the first time I'm hearing them. And then, you would do me a favor if you sent this episode to every single person you know who loves Bach, because it's a cause for a celebration. But you're asking, a what? A brand new Bach piece? How is this possible? If I may quote myself, when I was asked to write an article for the Culture We Deserve, shout out to Jessa Crispin, about Bach's lost works, I said this at the end. In 1984, only 10 years after the discovery of the hand exemplar of the Goldberg Variations, a set of chorale preludes by Bach and others was discovered. These are the Neumeister chorales, which shed light on the young Bach's development. In 1999, an important archive in Kiev was finally opened, boasting some 5,000 autographs manuscript from the estate of C.P.E. Bach, where manuscripts in Johann Sebastian's hand were also found. And I go on to say that it is probably a mistake to imagine that, aside from the finale of the Art Fugue, if that is indeed missing, it's probably a mistake to imagine that Bach's great works are lost, but we will always be on the lookout for missing works by Bach, and if we find them, they will inevitably bring us joy. The safe bet is that they will be peripheral to his oeuvre, and yet still very beautiful. Okay, so here I am. I'm being put to the test. Let's see if I was right. Will the works today be peripheral to his oeuvre and still very beautiful? Let me catch you up on the recent discoveries of any sort since 1984. I mentioned 1984, the Neumeister chorales, 1999, the giant archive in Kiev, and then we have some, let's say, smaller ones. 2004, an aria in a box of birthday cards in the Anna Amalia Library was found. And this is really crazy because actually that very library burned down a month later in 2004. That's one way that Bach's works go missing. Think about that. We found this aria in a box. We found this Bach box a month before it would have been destroyed, sitting there for about 300 years, and right there under everyone's nose in this box of birthday cards, a 2-page piece of music by Bach. And there was no previous record of this music anywhere dating from October 1713. Bach would have been about 28 years old, and that was discovered in 2004. Those are truly new discoveries. Then we have pieces which are, let's call them newly christened. For example, actually on volume 3 of my complete works for solo keyboard, I think it's actually the opening track. I play a fuguetta that was only written about and published as of 2008. But, copies of it had been around for a while in the archives. We knew about it. And in that same year, a, quote, new organ work was discovered. But that also was passed down by various publishers, copyists, and, only with the discovery of a certain missing link in the source tradition or something definite in the quasi-scientific method where we can now say this is authentic. Now the scholastic community as a whole decides to say this is J.S. Bach. I put a stamp on it. But I don't think we're talking about those today. This is apparently previously unknown, so this could be really, truly very interesting. And since that birthday card box was in 2004, that's probably what the Bach Archive is referring to when they say a discovery in over 20 years. It's been 21 years since that little aria. So I hope you're ready for this. It's not often when your favorite band, 275 Years Dead, releases 2 singles. Now, what do I think the works will be? Let's put my credibility on the line a little. Well, seeing as they're called solo works, we can imagine the instrumentation. I bet it's we bet it's either harpsichord or organ. It would be quite unexpected to see any other instrumentation turn up. The cello suites, the violin works, those for solo strings are accounted for in the first list of works by his first biographers. In other words, they're not peripheral. The flute partita, however, is a solo work not accounted for in the first list of works. Wouldn't that just set the wind world on fire if there were something like that? But I really doubt it. A snare drum study, something like that, we'd all be a little suspicious. So we assume for keyboard, that is a rather safe bet, harpsichord or organ. And I assume instead of we assume because it's going out on a limb a little bit. I assume it's going to be an early work, or if it is a mature work, I would think it would be a work for pedagogical purpose. The Vulgata that I mentioned, printed in 2008, that was a piece written out in a lesson for a student of Bach's. It was unknown because we hadn't looked through the student notebooks and whatnot. But then all these years later, the handwriting, the style, we say, wait a minute, is that actually the handwriting of the master? And there we had a mature work. So something like that could be the case today, a mature work somehow connected to his teaching. But I sort of think it's going to be an early work where he's still working on his abilities, still trying to achieve command of his contrapuntal and creative faculties. And if I will go out even further on this limb, I think that the pieces today will be connected to a chorale prelude of some sort. That's my bet. I mean, if we're taking odds here, Schenners is putting his money on early organ chorale-based music. But 2 works, 2 organ chorales? Are these works connected in any way? If it's for the harpsichord, but again, my money's on the organ. If it is indeed for the harpsichord, maybe some early fugue, some early toccata-like writing, could it somehow be related to a suite? Could it be like a single suite movement, a saraband, an allemande somewhere? My gut tells me probably not. So I suppose I'm betting on 2 early organ chorales, maybe some early fugal writing, 2 short harpsichord fugues. I don't know. Let's see. I'm going to tune into the live stream now, and I'll see if we can make something out of this, and then I'll get this to you as soon as possible, and we can celebrate today, November 17th, 2025. New Bach music.
This is the WTF Bach podcast.
Okay, wow. I just listened to the stream. I was too busy listening, trying to figure out what was going on, trying to identify the style, the piece, too busy to speak over it. And then there were speeches by politicians. It was quite the event for Leipzig. The whole Bach world and everyone in Leipzig and Saxony was there. Guess who played the new works? Why, it's the previous guest of the show, Mr. Ton Koopman. And what were these new works? Why, they were organ works. Yes, and they were early organ works. But they were not chorale-based organ works. So did I win the bet, or did I win like 2/3 of the bet? They were 2 chaconnes. How exciting is this? Koopman played the 2 chaconnes twice. The first time, I admit he played quite sloppily. Then all the speeches. Then he just played again, and he played it better the second time. So I'm going to play the second time where he played. And right before Koopman played the second time, Peter Volney, who is the director of the Bach Archive, he spoke. He mentioned the discovery of these pieces. It's sort of what I imagined, that these had actually been found previously in 1992, actually. But it was a link. It was a letter and some new handwriting samples that finally connected the chain of scrutinous scholarly events that led everyone here in the Bach Archive to say, yes, this is officially J.S. Bach. So let me briefly summarize that there. The 2 chaconnes exist in one source only, in the Royal Library of Brussels. They are called two chaconnes by an anonymous composer. Now, Volney identified the scribe as a man named Solomon Gutner John. He was a scribe born 10 years after Bach. He was a student of Bach in Arnstadt. Now, the two chaconnes are from 1705, 1707, and in 1727, so some 20 years later, we have a letter from John stating in an application in Schleiz that he had received his training from, quote, the former organist in Arnstadt, that is Johann Sebastian Bach, and John copied his teacher's early work during his time in Arnstadt as his student. The problem, as Volney describes, is that the letter was dated 1727, and that the sources were 1705, so some 20 years earlier. So how was this resolved? Through handwriting, through other things that turned up. I will let Volney sum it up for you. I will include his English translation of the speech at the end of Copman's playing. But onto the music. What we have here are two early predecessors of the organ Passacaglia in fugue in C minor. We've got a D minor chaconne and a G minor chaconne. The D minor chaconne uses many keyboards, sort of like an echo texture. That was something that Bach was doing early. The B-flat major suite comes to mind with this echo. It has very many variations, and then it has a fugue in the middle of it, quite a long fugue. Volney says that it's longer than any other fugue he had seen in the hundreds of similar pieces he studied. And then he goes back to the variations. Now, the G minor chaconne, which is the second piece, that has got these moments that sound almost exactly like the Passacaglia and fugue, these single lines outlining arpeggios. Some of you, I think what I'll have to do is an episode on these two early chaconnes and then the Passacaglia and fugue, and how these are really the early versions of the Passacaglia and fugue, because the Passacaglia and fugue, around 1710, we see how in those 3 years, assuming these are 1707, in those 3 years between these two chaconnes and in that well-known masterpiece, he's really grown. This is exciting news. These pieces are the models to that well-known work. So, how exciting. We've got the models for that wonderful work that we've known and loved all our lives, the Passacaglia and fugue, and I don't think I've ever featured the organ in the Thomaskirche on this show before. I mean, that maybe can't be right, but maybe I haven't featured it sort of explicitly and a lot. So yeah, enjoy this. Ton Koopman playing two newly discovered chaconnes by Bach. Are you enjoying today as much as I am? Followed by Peter Volney's speech. I will put that at the end, but I really hope you just enjoy the music. And thanks for listening to this episode, for supporting the show, and of course for sending this to all your friends who love Bach. What a day. Thanks. Yeah, so that was Ton Koopman playing BWV's 1178, followed by 1179. The Chaconne in D minor and the Chaconne in G minor. I think you can really see the early versions of the Passacaglia and Fugue. Now, here is Volney's speech. It is one of those slightly awkward voice-over translations. Hope you don't mind it, though. What Volney is saying is very, very fascinating, and I think it represents the respectable job of a Bach scholar, what it means to assert that a composition deserves a composer's name attached to it. I think it's quite fascinating. It's like detective work. I've always said that. It's detective work. So we'll hear Peter Volney's detective story, and then I will leave you. I really hope you enjoy the episode.
German Minister of State Weimar, the Saxon Minister of State Ms. Klepsch, Mayor Professor Knölker, President of the Saxon Academy of Sciences and Humanities, colleagues of the Royal Library in Brussels who are not present here, but they are watching the stream, I know. Ladies and gentlemen, the search for unknown works by Joyous Bach has a long tradition. It began in the early 19th century when enthusiastic Bach devotees, among them Mendelssohn, set out to track down, preserve, and rescue from oblivion the composer's widely scattered and then still scarcely surveyed oeuvre. The attributions made by these pioneers, driven by an explorer's enthusiasm, were, however, often more based on intuition than on rigorous analysis, and did not always withstand critical scrutiny. When two anonymously handed down organ works from the early 18th century are presented today as compositions by the young Joyous Bach, a careful justification is therefore required. I would like to outline for you, ladies and gentlemen, why I ascribe these two pieces, just performed for the first time by Ton Koopman, to Bach. I would likely not have ventured forward with my considerations had Bach scholarship not made significant progress in recent years, progress on which I could build. For one thing, the Bach Archive in Leipzig has compiled extensive documentary material on Bach's life and environment over the past 2 decades as part of several research projects. Since 2023, this broad-based scholarly work has been consolidated and systematically continued in a project conducted in cooperation with the Saxon Academy of Sciences, the Bach Research Portal. And there is a sponsorship for 25 years, and we are grateful to have this project. Secondly, in his seminal 2009 study on the style, chronology and compositional technique of Bach's early works, the distinguished Bach scholar Jean-Claude Zehnder traced the artistic development of the young composer up to the beginning of the Weimar period, thereby defining for the first time the vocabulary of Bach's musical language with precision. Those were the prerequisites for my own work. That was the groundwork. And now the history of the discovery, and I've been asked several times already today. The Royal Library in Brussels preserves, among many other treasures, a compilation of organ music that includes copies of 2 anonymous chaconnes written by a previously neglected scribe. Chaconnes, like passacaglias, are stylized dances characterized by a constantly repeated bass line. And in the late 17th century, composers like Pachelbel and Dietrich Buxtehude turned this dance into an art form. and also top-notch organ works. When I first held the volume in my hands in the summer of 1992, it immediately struck me as a Central German source, apparently produced in Thuringia around 1700. At the time, and Christoph Wolff knows, I was planning, after my doctoral thesis, my second scholarly project, namely a study of the musical environment of the young Bach. So my interest was piqued, and I had copies made that have accompanied me ever since. I wanted to find out more about the scribe and the pieces. Any possible connection to Bach was, at first, no more than faint intuition. As a young staff member of the Bach Archive, I then had the opportunity, in the course of my work beginning in 1993, to examine hundreds, if not thousands, of musical manuscripts. As one of my interests lay in researching the countless scribes involved, I also created a folder for the copyist of the two Chaconnes. Over time, I discovered further copies in other libraries written in his hand, including demanding organ music by Johann Pachelbel, Johann Gottfried Walter, and also J.S. Bach. Eventually, I had nearly 20 examples, but the name of the scribe was still missing. At this point, I must emphasize how remarkable it is to work at the Bach Archive. My colleagues explore, with varying areas of focus and lines of inquiry, the foundations of our knowledge about Bach, his family, and his historical environment, and we regularly exchange ideas about our work as a team. One day, my colleague Bernd Koska discovered in Schleiz, in eastern Thuringia, a letter from a previously unknown musician named Salomon Günther John, who had been active in the village of Weira near Neustadt an der Orla. This letter was remarkable because John reports that he had at first been apprenticed to the former organist in Arnstadt and had later been active for some time at the High Princely Court Chapel in Weimar. And this established a direct connection to J.S. Bach. After some time, I began to think I recognized similarities between John's handwriting in that letter and the writing in the sources I had collected. But there was a problem. The letter dates from 1727, while the musical copies must have been produced roughly 20 years earlier. There were discrepancies that had made me skeptical. And documents from John's earlier years were nowhere to be found at first. And the story could have stopped here or could have gone on for 20 more years, but sometimes we are lucky. And John tells us that in the years around 1714 to 1716, immediately after leaving Weimar and his teacher Bach, and taking up his organist post in Weira, John first worked as a court clerk at the Oppurg Manor. This is a manor between Saalfeld and Weira. And it turned out that the manor's archival records, missing for decades after the Second World War, had in fact survived as restitution material in the Hohenlohe Central Archive in Neuenstein in Württemberg. And not only that, we are now in 2025, by the way, and not only that, they had recently become accessible again, those court archives. And while examining the court files, I quickly came across early handwriting samples by John, and these matched the script found in the musical sources. In short, Salomon Günther John must have produced his copies of the two Chaconnes around 1705-1707 in Arnstadt, practically under the eyes of his teacher, Joyous Bach. Supported by these findings, my second line of reasoning turned to the remarkable musical character of the two works. For these Chaconnes are far from routine pieces. They prove to be highly individual in nature. For the Chaconne in D minor, the piece Mr. Koopman played first, the composer chose a strikingly complex ostinato theme spanning 7 bars, and as the piece unfolds, however, individual variations expand to 8, 12, and even 16 bars, and the ascending bass line is interrupted in 2 places by rests, and in this way, the ostinato, beyond merely outlining a harmonic progression laid down in the bass notes, acquires a melodic profile of its own. Within the individual variations, one repeatedly encounters unusual features foreign to the genre, which stand out clearly from the traditions otherwise cultivated in chaconnes and passacaglias of the early 18th century. Noteworthy, for example, is the play with echo effects in the lower octave, and the resulting fragmentation recalls techniques familiar from Georg Böhm's chorale settings. Techniques the young Bach likely absorbed during his years in Lüneburg, 1700 to 1702, and that shaped his style well into the Weimar period. Also unusual is the transfer of the ostinato to the upper voice, to the treble, together with its seemingly canonic treatment in treble and bass, offset by 1 bar. And unusual, finally, is the extended fugue at the center of the work, built on the ostinato theme used as a soggetto. And at nearly 90 bars, this fugue is by far the longest section of the composition. And now you can compare. I have compared hundreds of pieces by other composers of the time. The only other substantial fugue within an ostinato is with Bach in the monumental Passacaglia in C minor. In that work, composed probably around 1710, the contrapuntal elaboration and its integration with the variation section are handled with far greater mastery. By comparison, the chaconne in D minor appears as a youthful preliminary study of the later, more mature Passacaglia. The chaconne in G minor, the second piece, avoids cross-genre formal experimentation, yet proves to be a highly complex and strikingly effective virtuoso piece. Here, too, the ostinato is treated with rhythmic and harmonic flexibility, especially the parallel to the chaconne, which is similar to the cantata For Thee, O Lord, I Long, composed in 1707. Indeed, the G minor chaconne reveals itself as an early sister piece to Bach's cantata movement. For both pieces, the only possible composer is the young Joyous Bach. These chaconnes, heard here for the first time in more than 300 years, expand the early organ repertoire of Joyous Bach by 2 remarkable new compositions. They offer scholars welcome insights into the artistic development of the young master. I hope, however, that they will also find a place in musical life more broadly. Ladies and gentlemen, I have spoken at length about my own research and the research carried out at the Bach Archive. Much of this work remains invisible at first glance, yet every newly uncovered mosaic piece enriches the picture of one of the greatest composers our culture has produced. I turn to my colleagues. I wish all of you similar discoveries. It's a privilege to work at such an institution. This is made possible by the ongoing support we receive from the city of Leipzig, the Free State of Saxony, the federal government, and more recently from the Saxon Academy of Sciences, for which I express my sincere thanks. I'm also indebted to our loyal private supporters and sponsors, above all the members of our Board of Trustees and our two Friends Associations, as well as numerous private benefactors who help us in our work through donations, large and small. And let me add, your money is well spent with us, and if you wish, we are grateful for that money. And if you wish, you may purchase a copy of the limited special edition at the exits, and the proceeds support our work. Last but not least, I'd like to thank all of my colleagues of the Bach Archive and the city of Leipzig, all my colleagues who have prepared this day diligently. Without you, we would not have achieved all this. Ladies and gentlemen, musical artworks of the past require, in order to unfold and have an effect, a sounding realization in a continually renewed present. And to do justice to this fact, it is perhaps time to stop talking, and I would like to ask Ton Koopman to perform the two chaconnes once more. And I wish you great pleasure in listening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your interest in our work.